Well, we've reached the end of 2025, and as always on my channel, I like to close out the year by taking questions from you guys and answering them in an unscripted format to sort of more directly interact with my subscriber base and just kind of get feedback on the sorts of things you want me to talk about, and so I'm not always just beholden to whatever the algorithm expects me to make videos on. This year, though, you guys really surpassed my expectations because I believe I have 18 questions to get through. That is quite a bit more than any of the previous years that I've done this, and I'm happy to get all that feedback, of course. But that means I really want to jump into these right away and not delay much longer. Some of these are going to be quick answers that I can just fire off and move on to the next one, while others will involve more in-depth discussion. And I'm breaking them up more by length and theme because of that. So if you submitted multiple questions, you're not necessarily going to see all of yours clumped together. They're going to be more spread out according to what takes me the longest to answer or something like that. So no more delaying, let's just get into the first set of questions that I have. What Fire Emblem meme do you just find unfunny? There is, I think, a really obvious answer to this that anyone would have to say for this, especially if you've been in the fandom long enough to be aware that this guy was a meme, but everything about Geb from Sacred Stones has aged very poorly. This guy became a meme basically because he's morbidly obese and his portrait is very unflattering, and because he talks about, well, forcing himself on Tana and other women. And because 2000s era humor is what it was, those two things combined to turn him into this mimetic joke about how he's so beautiful and, I think, powerful. I think that's another aspect of it. I don't really remember too much. Again, this is from back in like the late 2000s, so almost 20 years ago that Geb was a meme. But yes, it is very dated, very cringeworthy humor now, and extremely unfunny. As far as more modern stuff that's not just it aged poorly, I never really got into the Claude upside down memes. Like, I get why that's a thing, and the voice actor even played it up during pre-release, but it does just seem kind of silly, and it is unfortunate because one of the problems with Claude and his writing in both Three Houses and Three Hopes is that he's not taken as seriously by the developers compared to the other two house leaders, and he and the Golden Deer are treated more as ancillary to the other two houses and what they've got going on, because IS just doesn't seem to be all that interested in writing a genuine three-sided conflict. So in both games, he's more or less stapled onto one of the other two sides. So Claude upside down memes are more like just one symptom of how not just the developers but also fandom tend to diminish his presence in Three Houses and Three Hopes. Alright, which would be a stronger omen of Fire Emblem Heroes approaching end of service? Bride Edelgard or the fabled young demigod dagger dancer duo? The person who sent me this one later retracted it jokingly because of the banner that I'm currently playing right now being a much more obvious indicator of end of service, but then it turned out to not really be the case because now we have Book 10 foreshadowing that we're going to get at least 3 more years of this stuff. So IS is truly shameless with their recycling of power creep units. But anyway, I did want to still answer this one because there's a very good chance we're going to get one of these two units in the next 6 months or so. Of those two units, though, I think Bridal Edelgard would feel more like a jumping the shark moment, because the Bridal banner has always been largely superfluous and just kind of there to be fluffy and to plug the whole waifu harem mechanic that Fire Emblem, or modern Fire Emblem, has really pushed recently. The young or the child banners that we get in April, those tend to be more story focused and more based around just, exploring the backstory of one single game, so they get to be more serious. And the Fogland games have plenty of, space for serious banners, although IS is not shy about putting them in like summer banners and winter banners where they're, it's just, you're putting them in cute or skimpy outfits. I would think they would do the Duo Demigod before Bridal Edelgard, and I know a lot of people do not want Duo Demigod because Demigod is a ship that almost nobody likes because it pisses off so many different factions in the fandom at the same time. But IS doesn't seem to care much about that, and I could see them making that as a duo unit. Whereas a Fodlan bridal event, I'm just imagining the discourse now, and I'm pretty sure it's eventually going to happen. I just hope that when it does, we're far enough into the future to where people just learn how to chill out a little bit. I know that's asking for too much, especially since I've seen how one line from the new Lysithea alt has just inflamed discourse all over again about whether or not she's an honorary eagle or whatever. But if I had to pick one of these two, Bridal Edelgard would be the bigger jumping the shark moment. Thoughts on these random FE characters? Alright, sure. Lithis from FE5, kind of creepy, though that fits the general tone of Thracia being as dark as it is. Didn't leave much of an impression on me, to be honest, but then I really have not played FE5 in quite a while, and it's not a game I return to with relish. Not because of the story, I do like the story, but so much the gameplay. Makalov from FE9 and 10. Ugh, that pink hair is not helping him. I get that he's supposed to be a throwback to, like, Mathis from the Arcanea games, but yeah, the cotton candy look is just not great, and he's a pretty terrible character as is, and if I recall, he's good-ish in Path of Radiance, although other paladins are better than him because they come earlier, and then in Radiant Dawn, he's just kind of bad, or just not worth using, or I never really saw him as much. One thing I did like, though, about Radiant Dawn Makalov is that to indicate his gambling issues and constant poverty, when you promote him to Gold Knight, his the barding on his horse has patches on it, like it's sewn together from, multiple tears of that sort of thing. I thought that was a nice touch when you compare that to the barding on the other paladin characters. Dayan from FE6. Kind of a daddy, to be honest. I don't really remember much of him. He doesn't leave. Like, he's a late game recruit on one of the two routes, so you may not even get him in a playthrough. And I know he's got stuff going on with his granddaughter, and then his granddaughter's bodyguard, who is also her love interest. I don't really remember that much else about Dayan. I mean, I know he's Wrath's father, Wrath from FE7, but yeah, Binding Blade just doesn't really do a lot for me, unfortunately. You pick some guys I just don't have a lot of passion for. I'm sorry, but I'd rather be honest about that than try to invent all sorts of wild things about them that I just don't actually believe. Did Arvis truly do nothing wrong? This is a funny one because I know perfectly well that no one actually believes that Arvis did nothing wrong. That expression just became a meme as an outgrowth of the Edelgard did nothing wrong meme because Arvis is the OG Flame Emperor. However, when I saw this question, I was strongly reminded of an essay that a former blog mutual of mine, who is no longer active in the fandom, put out, talking about were people actually reevaluating Arvis in the wake of Three Houses and what it does with Edelgard, and laying out all the reasons why. No, Arvis did actually do a lot of things wrong, even if you're just looking at him from a purely political perspective, like the people he allied with himself and all of the people he killed or allowed to be killed to get where he was. It's pretty nasty, and then you gotta throw on the whole child hunts and the fact that he marries his own sister and has children with her. That's a whole sidebar to it, but just even as a guy who's trying to take over the continent, he conquers Celeste when they're basically not doing anything, and he gets their queen. He doesn't directly get their queen killed, but he allows her to be killed, and then he puts one of his allies' sons in charge of Isaac, which leads to the horrible treatment of those people over the time skip. And it's like he's supposedly taking control of the continent, but he has no actual control over any of these people, and that's not even getting into the whole thing with Julius being possessed by the Dark Dragon and having all the actual power, the supernatural stuff. It's just that he gets in bed with some very bad people and just goes along with them doing a whole lot of murdering and not being very competent rulers either. You see that a lot in what House Frege does in Thracia. But anyway, yes, Arvis did do a lot wrong, and I do not think that anyone is legitimately going to defend him, and if they do, it's more of like as a joke, or will a remake give Arvis a route that shows that he was right all along, actually, and Sigurd was the terrible person? I mean, Sigurd's got a lot of stuff wrong with him, mostly that he's kind of an idiot. But yeah, Arvis is not really a good person. And again, if you want to debate the political thing, then I can just bring in all the stuff that I'm kind of leaving out. Again, the thing that he bangs his own sister and has children with them. And that the game sort of tries to make this palatable by emphasizing that he loves his daughter, who is also his niece. And that's just a level of weirdness that few other franchises would even try to touch. So in that sense, I do kind of respect Fire Emblem for just having the audacity to go there. But yeah, it does not reflect well on Arvis. Alright, moving on. Top 10 favorite heroes art. These aren't going to be in any particular order. These are just 10 that I selected based on a variety of factors. You'll probably be able to pick up on some of them very soon. But let's just go through them very quickly. First up, Pirate Tabarn. Tabarn is hot no matter what you do with him, pretty much, but I think the Pirate alt is a little bit more interesting in that score. Also, I like his face a little bit better here compared to his base art. Fargus. Not even because I find this guy particularly attractive, but he's got nipples and chest hair. And how often can you say that you see that in Fire Emblem Heroes? As sad as that is. On a similar note, Dagdar, who just came out this summer, because, hey, he's got chest hair. Wonders never cease. A bit more oddly, Deke, in his original Binding Blade art, looks okay, but I don't know. I'm just not in love with how he looked in FE6, and his in-game portrait isn't great either. But seeing him in Heroes, it kind of gives him a more, I guess, more conventional look, but also more dynamic and interesting. And hey, he's a mostly shirtless guy. Sometimes that's all you need. Hot Springs Ryoma, specifically the damaged art here, gets on this list solely because it's about the closest Heroes has ever come to showing us actual guy naughty bits. Because there's really nothing much left to the imagination with what's under that little bit of cloth there. For a much older seasonal, Spring Xander, because this was actually the very first seasonal banner that Heroes did back in spring of 2017, and everyone was memeing on how ridiculous this all looked. But I just loved how campy they went with Xander, the pink suit and the giant carrot, which, there are jokes to be made about that. And looking back at this art from many years later, it's a shame that the artists of this game have always been more conservative about putting male characters in these ridiculous kinds of outfits. You don't see this anywhere near as often as you do with the women, which is just really unfortunate on multiple levels. For a non-seasonal, and this is a bit cheating, I think, because I've never actually spent money on Heroes, so I don't own any of the Resplendents, but Resplendent Lloyd, my god, what a glow-up, because everyone hates his base art. His base art is very strange. His face is very strange looking in it, and nobody likes his art. But while I'm not in love with the green and black color scheme, he looks so much better here, and Lloyd is actually one of the more decent-looking antagonist minor characters in the GBA game, so I like seeing him, get art that represents that well. For another Resplendent, Brave Dimitri, and this one came out only about a month or so ago or thereabouts, and when it released, I saw on Twitter that a lot of people were calling this art gay, both in a positive and a negative sense, because, Twitter. But I tend to really think that that pose is great, and that is a wonderful look for Dimitri, and as anyone who's been on this channel long enough knows that I do like Dimitri's abundance of gay subtext. So good on you, great look for you. Unfortunate that I won't ever actually get to use this version of Dimitri because I'm not spending money on it. Brave Claude, like this is base Brave Claude, he hasn't had a Resplendent yet, although that's one is probably coming. Of all of Claude's artwork in Heroes, I think this is the one that makes him the most adult looking, which kind of sells his appeal better than the teenage Claude that they tend to go with more. I know that's generally true for all of Three Houses characters, is that they prefer the pre-time skip versions. But this Claude actually looks pretty nice, and I would be interested to see what they do in his upcoming Resplendent, assuming he is getting one and he doesn't get shafted like Claude often does compared to the other two house leaders, and Byleth as well. And finally, this is one that I highlighted in a video last year, but it's still one that I really enjoy. Legendary Camilla, because she's got the purple, green, and gold of New Orleans Carnival, and she's even wearing beads. Like, this would be a great carnival theme design, and it makes me wonder why IS has never tried out like a carnival seasonal in January, because that would be a much more timely and interesting seasonal idea than the desert banner that they do in January and that everybody online seems to hate for valid reasons. I mean, there's so much you could do with the idea of a carnival masquerade, and also if it's not too much for me to point out, I should say that Carnival is more of an international celebration than the American Halloween is. So it is kind of dumb that we have a Halloween banner, but not something like Carnival. Now I have 3 questions that all have to do with the Fortune's Weave trailer. We're going to have to do a little bit of freeze frame stuff on this, but I should be able to go through it fairly quickly because, of course, we don't really know all that much about Fortune's Weave yet. First up, as far as I can tell, the units marked with tome icons in FD18's trailer aren't holding anything. Is a return of spell list at hand? We already know that, in addition to Fodlan-typical weapon uses draining combat arts, blaze arts that act like FE15 combat arts with an HP cost have been introduced. Does this carry any implications for how magic might work this time? My best guess is that, especially because this is another Fodlan game, that it's going to follow the magic system that we got in those games where you can use a certain number of spells per map. It would be interesting if they also had HP draining spells, like maybe like a base spell that everyone had if you ran out of spell uses. Otherwise, something you could still use, kind of like how if your weapon breaks, you can still use it, but you're at a massive disadvantage if you do. That, I think, would be an interesting combination of the Valentia and Fodlan approaches to spell list. I am generally expecting that spell list will be returning this time. As far as blaze arts, we don't really know much of anything about them, whether between combat arts, blaze arts, and maybe gambits that those return, which they probably will. There's going to be a lot of extra buttons to click in this game, and it'll be interesting to see just how all of that gets balanced. These two I'm going to answer roughly at the same time. Thoughts on that one Dietrich associated mage guy? Shows up as a green unit near Dietrich in Kai's segment, then again as a blue unit in Dietrich's segment. Or rather specifically on the fact that the second time, though not the first time, we see him, he's in what looks like the FE16 men's dancer outfit. Does this mean nothing? Is this unique to him? Or is the dancer class once again available to most characters? Not going to say anything about his character right now. Again, would not surprise me, however, if they follow the previous Fodlan games and Dancer is now generic, or at least mostly generic. I'm a little more interested in the thought that since one of the other leads, Lita, is sort of a dancer or performer herself, how that's going to interact with a generic dancer class. Whether she'll have the refresh, or maybe Dancer will not have the traditional refresh, and it'll just be a different kind of sword unit, kind of like what Three Hopes did. Although, of course, Three Hopes is a Warriors game, so it couldn't really have the unit refresh concept. But I'm curious to see how those two ideas will interact with one another. And thoughts on the sword infantry guy, dark skin, orange and brown hair, scar over his left eye, a bit of stubble, who shows up as a blue unit for Kai, Theodora, and Dietrich. Mercenary who joins regardless of route in a multiple route game, or someone who transfers armies in an FE10-like narrative. I'm not going to conjecture on what this guy might be like based on like a split second of video footage that you can't even really see that well, anything about him. I would be leaning more to him being like a generic recruit that anybody can have. Now, whether that means multiple routes or whether it's a linear story and you can kind of just get him at different points, this doesn't seem to be building up like a faction drama anywhere near as much. So maybe he's like the Mozu from Fates, where you can just get him in a paralogue early on, regardless of who you're playing as, and that'll just be how you obtain him, and probably some other characters will be like that. I don't expect everybody in Fortune's Weave to have a very strong factional tie, especially if there are no strong factions. I would ask if there are any Fire Emblem-like games that you've played that equal or surpass the quality of Fire Emblem. For example, I've been playing Dark Deity 1 and 2, but 2 is the real star as far as quality goes. Very fun and unique. That's a good recommendation. I did play the original Dark Deity. You can actually see if you go way back into my channel when I was still figuring out what kind of content I wanted to produce, that I did some stuff on Dark Deity. I enjoyed it. The story and character writing just didn't really stand out to me enough, and while I did try out the demo of the second game, I felt like it was more like even more gameplay focused than the first one, so I just didn't bother with the full release. You can sort of say similar things about the other ones that I've tried, like Lost Eidolons, which it has great production values for an indie game. It almost has like a AAA feel, even though it's clearly cribbing stuff from Three Houses in the way that some of its systems are built up. But I don't think I've ever gone back to that after the first playthrough, and I did not check out the second Lost Eidolons, which is more of a roguelike Fire Emblem, is how it's being described, which I find a very odd concept, but you know, people like that. Another one that I have done videos on this channel is Triangle Strategy, the HD 2D game. It's definitely fun to play through, and they try a lot of the heavy political drama angle that Three Houses was going for, so it's kind of more in that, I guess, Game of Thrones vein, if that's the sort of thing you go for. I had issues with it that I laid out in video form several years ago now. The thing about recommending other tactics games is that, and I don't think any other Fire Emblem tuber will ever say this, but I don't play Fire Emblem that much for the tactical element. Obviously, I get involved with it because you have to, it's part of the gameplay. But since I play on the lowest difficulties, I tend to just use units that I like, and especially when I'm doing older games, I will frequently use cheating devices to get through them faster, or just get through them in ways that you can't actually do just with a base game. And I don't mean like 0% growth or the stuff that people do to make the games harder. I mean usually to make them easier. Because I'm more into the characters and the relationships and the soft-core dating sim elements that have been a major feature of Fire Emblem since Awakening, and that's why you see me covering, or wanting to cover, dating sims, like actual dating sims, just as much if not more, and I do occasionally get around to that. So it's kind of hard for me. Would I recommend any of the ones that I mentioned? Probably of those, Triangle Strategy is the one I would rate the highest. It definitely did not hold me long term, even compared to the other HD 2D games, and I'm going to be talking about some of those more later in this video, but of those, if I had to name one, it would be Triangle Strategy. These next three are going to go by really fast, and they're just going to be me disappointing people, because the answer will be quick and not very remarkable. What are your thoughts on Teak Fiction, aka Fire Emblem The Last Promise? I haven't played it. I've heard that it's a particularly polished early GBA ROM hack that has solid gameplay, but I've also heard it's got a lot of cliches and 2000s era edginess and humor, sort of like the Geb meme thing that I mentioned way back at the start of this video. So that doesn't really endear me to the idea of playing it. Did you play the other Kaga games, you know, Tear Ring or Bearwick Saga? Again, no. In this case, my answer is going to be mostly because I did say this a little earlier, but I've never really been very fond of the gameplay of Thracia or FE5, and that game to me feels like Kaga was just starting to go overboard with like all these little gameplay features and things that just feel clunky and excessive, and maybe if you're really into the tactical stuff, but I'm not, and everything I've seen from all of his post-Fire Emblem work is that he just went even further in that direction, which endears me to them even less. I am pretty glad that the GBA games pared down all of that stuff, and that was my entry point. My first Fire Emblem was FE7, so I got used to the more simplistic Fire Emblem of that era, and then I've slowly built up to the more complicated and overdone stuff of like Awakening and Fates and so forth. So yes, I've never played any of Kaga's stuff after Fire Emblem. Last bit of disappointment. Have you ever played Okami? Just gonna go out and say it, no I have not. It has something of a reputation as a high-minded artistic achievement and one of the best video games of all time, but in actuality, besides being an engaging Zelda-like with dungeons and everything, it is also borderline FE levels of shameless, which is why I ask. I think the main reason I never played Okami was kind of related to something that you said there and the year that it came out, because that reminded me that Okami came out like at about almost exactly the same time as Zelda Twilight Princess. So back then I was getting my fill of Zelda stuff with actual Zelda, and I won't say that Twilight Princess is my favorite Zelda ever, but it's probably up there. I mean, I do tend to enjoy the dungeons of it, and I can live with the browner, more washed out tone that has sort of come under scrutiny in a post Skyward Sword Breath of the Wild era. But yeah, Twilight Princess was taking up my attention at that time, along with probably other games that escaped me that were big in 2006, 2007. So I just never got around to Okami. I don't know if I would go back and play it. Maybe if it came to NSO or something like that, I would give it a try. But currently, I don't have any plans to do so. I have a lot of other games on my plate. What Fire Emblem character is the most homophobic and why? This question I can take one of two different ways. Are we talking about, does the character express homophobic sentiments in universe? Or is the way that they are written actually homophobic? Because those are, again, two different levels of considering a character. If we're talking about a character expressing homophobic sentiments, I'm almost certain that the award, such as it is, has to go to something from Awakening. Especially the Harvest Festival DLC, because, God, there is a lot of terrible stuff in here. There's the Vake and Lonqua one is the one that sticks out to me the most as just being, oh, this is a really painful way to sort of acknowledge that gay people exist for the first game ever in your franchise, because prior to this, none of the Fire Emblems really came out and said that part out loud, and it's not pretty. Now, if you're talking about characters that are written in a homophobic way, there are multiple options, some from Awakening. Excellus is a very big one, and I talked about him in my video on trans and non-binary characters. I can see why, I don't think I got any comments defending the way that Excellus is written and presented, because, yes, it is very uncomfortable to look at this character who could be a feminine gay man or a trans woman. There's the Bara Bandits from Awakening, who are really into each other in an uncomfortable way, and I know Fire Emblem does that as a running gag, but Victor and Vincent are, I think, the only time they've done that kind of subtext, bordering on text, with same-sex characters, and so to have them be like these petty recurring villains is just not pleasant. While it's not as direct of what I would say call homophobic, having Priam just be as an Easter egg in this game as like a maybe he is, maybe he isn't biological descendant of Ike, and that single-handedly reignited 5-year-old wank over whether or not Ike is gay, I'm not fond of that decision. If I were to name something, a homophobic character, not from Awakening, because I'm dragging this game a lot, then that's easily going to be Soleil from Fates, because in Japanese, she is a schoolgirl lesbian stereotype, which means that she's not really a lesbian, she just likes cute things, and she's emotionally immature, and she just needs to meet a guy, and then she'll be straight, which, yes, is homophobic, because it's just it's just a phase kind of thing. And there was only so much the localization could really do to clean that up. They try to have her be openly bisexual, but she still only has S ranks with guys. It's just that all of them except Forrest and, of course, Corin are platonic now. And the Forrest one, that has issues of its own with regard to gender presentation and gender identity. And, of course, Corin is required for the Avatar, so Avatars have to S rank everyone. There's also her supports with Ophelia, which are just pretty much just straight up sexual harassment, and it's played for laughs. It's supposed to be her riffing on her dad, Inigo/Laszlo, doing exactly the same thing, but a quote-unquote joke that's not funny when a man does it doesn't suddenly become funny when a woman does it. Soleil is just an uncomfortable character. I can see people trying to reclaim her and get, pull the better parts out of her to make her into a more positive depiction of a queer character. But as written, and especially in Japanese, she is quite homophobic. Favorite kingdoms, places, etc. in media that are clearly inspired by or trying to evoke France. Least favorite? There's a few different ways I thought about approaching this particular question. Just to start off with Fire Emblem, because it does have a few examples and I can get those out of the way pretty easily. Yeah, there's some like Augustria in Yggdrasil, and by extension Etrurian and Lead, that are just kind of... They have a very slight French feel to them. I would probably also lump in Zofia, especially in Echoes in the remake. has a bit of that with the fleur-de-lis symbology and all that. Fargus has a bit as well with regard to its emphasis on chivalry, and some of the names come from 19th century French literature, although there's also a lot of Russia spliced in there, along with probably some other things. I think probably the biggest Fire Emblem attempt to do a pseudo-France would be Firene and Engage, although it definitely has a more Dutch visual angle with, the tulips and the windmills and all that. That's very stereotypically Dutch. But all the Firene's names are French fashion brands, so that's quite on the nose. I don't really have many strong opinions about the Fire Emblem examples I just named, mostly because when you get down to it, it can be difficult to untangle something that is specifically evoking France with more of a generic medieval feeling, which I've seen a Tumblr post that's gone around that's dissecting what the generic medieval fantasy is actually pulling from, and it's a lot of French and German stuff with some English and Northern Italian as well. So it's just like this patchwork that does not really map well onto one specific culture or country. Other examples, I know I have done a lot with New Delsta in Octopath Traveler 2 in my fanfic, although that's more on myself. I made it a lot more like Paris and New Orleans. It may not necessarily be as it is in-game. I'm going to be talking more about that in a later question, so I'm not going to weigh that one too heavily. Pokemon has Kalos. I do like Kalos as a setting. I do think it's underutilized, like X and Y they're nice games, but I don't think they went far enough, and of course they didn't get a third version to flesh out the world more. Of course now we're getting more of that with Legends ZA, but as I'm going to state in the next question, I believe I'm going to make this one, I've never actually played Legends ZA, and I'm not really impressed by it. I'll just go out and say right now that I can't really get into the action gameplay of the Legends games. It just doesn't speak to me, and then ZA especially, with some of the choices it made compared to Arceus, where like there's trade evolutions now and some stuff is locked behind online battles. I don't care for that. I have seen a good bit of how it renders Lumiose, and it looks nice if a little generic of a city. I wish they put more of a French flair to it. Like, if I'm just thinking in video game terms, something like the Mario Kart 8, yes, that's the one, where they have all these renditions of real-world cities, and the racetrack based on Paris is actually quite lovely to look at. It may not be the best in terms of racing. I don't have many strong opinions on Mario Kart, but it is nice to look at least. Perhaps a more unusual pick here, but I do like the setting of Disco Elysium, which is most heavily inspired by post-Soviet Eastern Bloc countries, which is not something I'm terribly familiar with, but there are also various French names and nods to French culture and political movements, and I just generally like the feeling of the city there, Martinez, and how it's this cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, delightful mess of people all coming together. And it's a colonial city too, and since I'm from New Orleans, and New Orleans is of course a cosmopolitan colonial city, it's more relatable to me on those grounds than if it were trying to directly evoke France itself, the metropole. That would probably be my pick for my favorite, or at least the one that I think is the most creative of a setting incorporating French elements. I don't know if I directly have a worst one. I mean, there was one thing in media, not video games, that immediately sprang to mind when I thought of like worst depictions of anything French in media, but it comes from a formerly popular and still quite popular children's book / movie series that is now controversial because of the author and that I don't like giving a lot of time to. And I also acknowledge that in addition to those books and movies being just really stereotypical and just bad at depicting French people, they're bad at that when it comes to basically every other type of person who is not English. So that's not terribly surprising. I think we, the French, got off pretty easily in that particular series. It could be a lot worse, and I don't want to give any more time to that, and I don't even really want to show that. So let's just move on to the next one, but just say I don't like that, and I think reading that when I was young was like one of my earliest hints that, yeah, this is just kind of, this person does not know how to write outside of a very narrow scope of a certain type of people. Let's go back to Pokemon now. Rank the Pokemon games you played, or at least the mainline ones. I've already said I haven't played the Legends games enough to really comment on them. And overall, while I did initially think of doing a tier list for this, like bringing a tier list up on screen here, I just don't have that many strong opinions about most Pokemon games. I think that's partially why I've never seriously pursued Pokemon videos as a YouTuber. There are some that do stand out to me more. I've already mentioned Kalos, not just because of the French thing, but I generally like how X and Y are laid out. They're nice to look at. I can tolerate the Gen 1 pandering in that game because it hadn't gotten quite as terrible as it would get in later generations, but it is probably one of my favorite settings. Another one that I really liked is the Hoenn games, more so in the remakes, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, just because they're very nice to look at. Again, nice tropical setting. I do enjoy a lot of Gen 3 Pokemon, even if it's pretty weak on the Ice types, which are my favorite type. I would say that I like Sinnoh in part because it's a much colder region, and so you do have more Ice types there in contrast to Hoenn. So I actually like both of those in their own contrasting ways. Unova I would consider kind of mid-tier. Like, I like the more urbanized feeling, but a lot of it just didn't go there. And I respect Black and White for their boldness in not having any of the older Pokemon involved. Let's see. I haven't really played enough of Sword and Shield to comment, and either I played them and I just don't have many strong feelings on them, or, you know, I didn't get into them enough. Like, I never even bought Scarlet and Violet's DLC because I had other stuff going on. When it comes to Gen 1, or Kanto rather, my hot take is that I actually think Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are my favorite rendition of Kanto, because, I mean, they are nice to look at, they're very streamlined, they incorporate some elements of later games, like the Fairy type and the Dark type, but not other things, so they're not as easy and as basic as they look, and they're also not as broken as the actual Gen 1 games, which are fun to watch. I do watch a lot of YouTubers who do stuff with Gen 1 because those games are not well coded in a lot of places, so they can be really entertaining to the things that people can do with them. So if I had to rank all of the Pokemon games, probably would be Kalos and Sinnoh would be overall the top, Hoenn just a bit below them, and then Kanto, specifically Let's Go, kind of in that upper tier. Mid-tier would be stuff like Johto, Alola, Paldea. I think I liked a little better than those. If I had to pick a worst one, it would probably be Galar, i.e. Sword and Shield, just because they're very linear, even for my taste. I don't think many of the Pokemon were very memorable there. The story did not stand out to me. I think I never actually finished Sword and Shield. I think I got up to the final tournament, and I was just so uninvested in everything that was going on that I just stopped. And I do not do that often in games. I usually do my best to get through to the end, but it just was not working for me. I'm aware that that's not actually a tier list, but this is only the first of 3 ranking questions that I got. So we are going to have more of that going forward, including with the very next one. Rank the Fire Emblem endings from each game from worst to best. This one I stared at for about a minute because, honestly, Fire Emblem's endings just don't stick out to me very much. There's not a lot of them going. They don't really tend to go for like these dynamic, interesting endings. I'm thinking of like even something Intelligent Systems has also done with Paper Mario, having like these character parades and interesting things like that. There's really not a lot of that going on in Fire Emblem, and so the best I can really do here is pick out some that I think were more memorable than others. I really enjoy Genealogy of the Holy War having this very modular ending. It's completely unlike any other game where everything you see is just going to depend on what characters you got, what pairings you made, and who inherited what and all that. And it is a very interesting take compared to the usual character ending cards, sometimes with paired endings, that sort of thing. I did like how Path of Radiance is transparent about how it's just setting up for a sequel and that it's not really a proper ending on its own. The monologue from Sephiroth is just, it always stuck with me as just an example of a game going dark right at the end, and I do think it was generally effective. I will say that was more effective for me than the ending of Blazing Blade, which sets up the plot of Binding Blade via a stinger and a scare cord with Zephiel. Like, it's really dramatic in the moment, but the first time I played that, I had no idea where that was leading, and I certainly didn't know that the game it was foreshadowing had already come out and was never going to leave Japan, and so I would have to play it via emulator. I actually heard that that scene from the epilogue of FE7 was removed in the European versions because they thought it would be too confusing for people. I would be amused to know if that's true or not. Fates' endings, particularly Birthright and Conquest, are good in the sense that they don't really pull punches with how there's been a lot of loss and conflict that is still unresolved in the story, and they definitely do not feel like perfect endings, even though they do have that sort of finality to them. In contrast to that, I will say I do not like Awakening's ending, especially the whole non-choice with Robin that just, it does not amount to anything, and that's just one of Awakening's biggest problem, is that it constantly undermines its own dramatic stakes via the ending or via having like almost every character who dies in the story then show up alive as a spot pass recruit later. The game just does not want to take itself seriously, and so I can't take it seriously. Awakening would probably be my pick for the worst ending of the Fire Emblem games that I can actually remember. There are quite a few, especially earlier on, like, you know, FE1 and FE2, where there's just, it's basically just a text crawl, and then there's some character endings, most of which are not particularly memorable either. And I don't think the DS remakes really did much to address those. At least Echoes did more with its ending, and it even had some of that bittersweet war is going to start again feel, which I do like that Fire Emblem usually goes there. With regard to Three Houses, I mean, the ending tapestries are nice, but it all feels very samey, and I know that's part of how, you know, they really wanted to pander to the player and not make these routes as politically impactful as people online would like to argue that they are. But it does tend to lead to the endings of Three Houses not feeling very substantial, and it's more just, you know, what character endings do I like, and that's mostly the gay ones, and that's not even properly getting into the endings themselves, so I'm not going to include that. What can I say about Engage? I guess it was slightly affecting the whole, you know, Martha's still waiting for a Lear. I would rank it average at best. I think that's about all of the ones that I have any sort of opinion on. Like I said, Fire Emblem just doesn't tend to do these big, dramatic, memorable ending pieces once the final boss is done and all that. So I'm just going to have to move on to the next question, which, as it happens, comes from the same person. So hopefully you won't be too disappointed, because this is my third and final ranking question, and I feel like I can actually do this one justice. Rank the Octopath 1 travelers from worst to best from a writing standpoint. I am a little glad you didn't ask me to do Octopath 2, because I could fill up an entire video just on that game. I have a lot more to say about those travelers. The first game, while I did definitely enjoy Octopath Traveler back in 2018, it didn't really grab me as much. In hindsight, it seems more like proof of concept for everything that the developers Team Asano wanted to do with HD 2D games going forward, including this current one that only came out a couple of weeks ago, Octopath Traveler 0, which I'm still playing through. And by the way, the 8 travelers from the first game are in that game, but I'm not counting anything from there. It's basically just glorified cameos anyway, and the developers even said that them participating in the events of this new game is not canon to their full stories from the first game, so I'm just discounting it, including because I've only actually gotten around half of them at the time that I'm recording this. But anyway, just going through the 8 travelers from the original game, worst to best, and again, the question said writing standpoint, so no gameplay or anything is being considered for that. Number 8, Tressa. First of all, her plucky little girl comic relief going out to explore a wide world thing just doesn't really grab me that much. There's just generally the fact that her story isn't really about her. It's about, first of all, the guy whose journal she's following because he's relevant to the overall plot, but also the reformed pirate who becomes her sort of mentor and has like a homo-romantic frenemy thing with a pirate who is now dead. That's alone is more interesting than anything Tressa herself is getting up to, and even then, if I'm looking for like toxic old man yaoi, the second Octopath does that one a lot better. And Tressa herself is just kind of cute and fluffy, and while that's nice to have in between some of the heavier stories that this game has, it just doesn't grab me individually. Also, there's the problem that her third and fourth bosses, the fourth being her final boss, both just come out of nowhere, and she's not the only one of these travelers who has that problem, but the fact that half of her bosses are just kind of there because the game realized that they needed a boss, it does not help her case at all. Number 7, Haunted. I know there are people who cannot stand the way she was localized with this very fake Middle English dialect that appears almost nowhere else in the game outside of the town that she's from, and has no equivalent in the Japanese, so again, it is just a localization choice. I know one person who just straight up could not finish the game because he was so irritated by Haunted's fake Elizabethan English thing that she's got going on. That doesn't bother me as much. What bothers me is more that, first of all, she's got even more of a problem that Tressa does with how most of her bosses just come out of nowhere, but also she just doesn't really have much of an antagonist or even an emotional hook beyond wanting to find her mentor / surrogate father figure who's gotten the same amount of endearing and difficult qualities that are espoused in Chapter 1, and it's never really developed past that. It's still just the same thing coming out over and over again. Oh, like, he's a gambler, he's irresponsible, but oh, he's a good sort of dad figure, and her arc, more or less, is coming to acknowledge that he is kind of her dad figure, I think. It's been over a year since I played this game, so I am going mostly off memory here. And while her final boss looks amazing, Red Eye, it's until you've read the big text dumps in the lead up to the final boss and know what it is, it's just not that personally engaging as an antagonist. And that's, again, true of all of her bosses before then, which are mostly just animals that she's hunting. It's just not very interesting to me. I do like the more somber tone compared to Tressa, and I feel like she does at least have a cohesive emotional arc that's about her, which is why I put it over Tressa, but I would not rank her any higher than that. Number 6, Alphen. If it were not for something that happens technically not even in his story, but rather in a post-game side quest, I probably would have bumped him up a few spots, but because that happens, I do have to account for it. Basically, Alphen is the poster child in this game for no homo, and Octopath Traveler in general is not a gay-friendly or even gay subtext-friendly series, even compared to Fire Emblem. But the thing is with him is that Alphen's biggest emotional connection throughout his entire story is his best friend who lives with him in his little village, and they have a very close, I'd say, quasi-coupley thing, especially with the fact that the friend has a younger sister that they seem to be sort of co-parenting. And that is what motivates him to go on his journey, is that his friend, tells him to get out and go. And then they even exchange medical sacks. You can make a joke about that if you want. And then cut to his chapter 4 and his big emotional turnaround that he needs to get over from his lowest point in the story is reading a letter in the sack from his friend telling him to, basically go do what you want to do, and I know that you're a good apothecary, and that sort of thing. And it's really heartwarming and all that, and it kind of helps me overlook the fact that Alphen's own final boss is another one of those, it just comes out of nowhere and it's just an animal that he's fighting. And that, and the fact that his chapters 2 and 3 really do have two good antagonists that really play off Alphen well and kind of showcase a darker side to the whole apothecary thing and to his superficially more lighthearted thing, so he's not as happy-go-lucky as Tressa and her story. But then you get to the post-game side quest, and it turns out that Alphen's friend has been pining for this woman who is a very minor character in a different Traveler story, and in a side quest you get the two of them together. And that, combined with the fact that Alphen is just very casually flirty with girls and that sort of thing in party banters and things, not so much in the story. And it's just really, you couldn't let them have the one thing. And there is one other male traveler in this game who does actually almost stick the landing with regard to these strong same-sex bonds that would interest me more because of what I like in media. But Alphen's does not, and in combination with that final boss thing, and yeah, I can't rank this one any higher than number 6. Number 5, Cyrus. I do see a lot of praise for this character. He's a sort of Sherlock Holmes type, although he doesn't really have a Watson to play off him. They've saved that for the second game. I'm not as invested in Cyrus as a character. I think he's a little hard to get into emotionally because he never really gets to even like a low point in his story. And kind of the closest thing to an emotional conflict I think he has is this debate, more academic debate over whether knowledge should be shared or not, which is his main conflict with the primary antagonist and also his chapter 3 boss. But then the other one is that in his first chapter, one of his students accuses him of an inappropriate relationship with another student, gets him fired for it, and then later on she gets redeemed because she comes to rescue him when he's been kidnapped, and he has to now rescue her. And it's just, I don't want to say that it handles such a delicate situation poorly or plays it for comedy, but they do repeatedly play for comedy the fact that Cyrus is just apparently the hottest guy known to women, and that all of these women are falling over him, and he's just totally aloof and doesn't understand it. Considering how generally heterosexual this game is, I have trouble reading into that and just saying, oh, it's because of the gay, or even the asexual, or something like that. And so I'm left with Cyrus's story being good, for some world building hooks, and the antagonist is the main antagonist is at least entertaining, and I do think the whole turning yourself into a weird sort of blood magic powered monster because you want to hoard knowledge, and the fact that this happens not once but twice in the story, it's a little overwrought, but then that's just sometimes what Octopath can be. So it's kind of in the middle of the pack. I mean, number 5 is quite in the middle, along with the next one, number 4. Ophelia. When I first started seeing previews for this game, I was pleasantly surprised to see that Ophelia is actually a really straightforward religious cleric type in a pseudo-Catholic church setting, and in JRPGs where we almost tend to expect that churches will be evil, so much so that it's created a lot of discourse in the Three Houses fandom, as I've talked about previously. It was just kind of refreshing that Ophelia is played totally straight. Her biggest issue is that she's a fundamentally nice person, but she doesn't feel fully accepted in her family, which is composed of her adoptive father, who's an archbishop, and his biological daughter, who is her adoptive sister. And because she's an adoptee, she doesn't really feel like a part of that family, which creates problems when their father gets sick and then later dies off screen, and her sister goes way off the deep end in trying to get him resurrected by an evil cult, and that's Ophelia's final boss. And so she not only has to juggle dealing with this cult that's trying to undermine the church, but also her frayed relationship with her sister, because Liana just really wants her dad back, and they have to come to grips with that. And it ends on a pretty sweet note of the two of them affirming that, yeah, they can't bring their dad back, but they still have each other, and it's really sweet. And I like that. I like that it doesn't have to be this grand conspiracy that the church as a whole is evil. And Octopath in general, while it does do church conspiracies across all of its games, it doesn't really settle on that, we have to destroy the entire church, because the gods of these settings tend to be mostly benevolent, except for the one token evil one. So there is that. Also, if you like lesbian stuff, Ophelia's story is either directly or tangentially where most of it in this game lies. So that's nice if you like that. I'm mostly indifferent to it, but in a game where you are pulling blood from a stone, if you want any gay content, you take what you can get. I will say that one thing holding Ophelia back at least a spot or two is that her Chapter 2 has to be the worst case of this game shoehorning in a dungeon and a boss when it didn't need to be there. Basically, her Chapter 2 summary is she goes to the town, does the thing that she's supposed to do there, and then some kids get lost in the woods and get attacked by a giant wolf, and she saves them, and it has nothing to do with what she's there for. And the best the game can sort of do to tie those together is to say that it's indicative of how she's a fundamentally kind person, which is something that we already knew. It's clearly not the only one. I've already mentioned a few other examples where this game just has to have a boss and a dungeon every single chapter, but it's easily the most egregious, and I'm thankful that in the second game they let some chapters breathe without either a dungeon or a boss or both, and just let them be dramatic story moments. That is overall more effective, and it gives you more structural variety as well. But anyway, moving on to number 3, Therion. I don't really care for the edgy loner thing he's going for, although it is appropriate for a thief. But on the plus side, his story has one of the most cohesive, setups for a 3-part arc after his introduction, which of course creates the 4 chapters that all of them have, but he's got 3 MacGuffins to collect, and so he has to go collect all of them, and that makes sense. And tying back to the edgy loner thing, he does have an emotional arc about learning how to trust people, and that has to do with both how he was burned in the past by a close associate, and again, there's a little bit of homoerotic tension there, or homoromantic, I guess you could say, and it's not really followed through on because Therian was screwed over quite badly from that, and the resolution is he leaves his former partner, as he calls him, to die, so it's definitely not anything you could really pull into Toxic Yaoi without playing around with some plot points. But overall, I think Therian's story hangs together well, and it has at least one surprising twist when you do see that his former partner Darius is actually back in the story around chapter 3, and that's kind of where the emotional angle comes in. It's not just him helping to retrieve the Dragon Stones, and that's a pretty good handling overall of Octopath's very constrained story structure. They're working within the 4-chapter setup. This isn't the only story that manages that by giving the traveler 3 things to pursue, but I would say it's the first one of the ones I've named, and we do have 2 more still to talk about that pulls that off quite well. So moving into my top 2, Ulbrich. I do feel like there's a bit of my personal bias in picking Ulbrich, because as a character, he is fairly bland, and unless you like the hammy over-the-top delivery by Patrick Sykes doing basically Hector's voice from Fire Emblem Blazing Blade, except here it's actually appropriate because Ulbrich is a man in his mid-30s, he's not supposed to be 17, so the voice actually fits. But aside from that, it is a generally good story here, one that has higher dramatic stakes than pretty much any of the others because it's trying to tell the story of a fallen kingdom and these wars on a grand scale that Octopath Traveler really can't pull off, and I'm seeing more and more as I play through Octopath Traveler 0 that when it tries to get into the big geopolitical conflict stuff, it kind of falls on its face and you just have to laugh a little and just take it what it's attempting to go for. The thing with Ulbrich here is that he is the character who comes the closest to having an actual homo-romantic connection with someone in his past who, like in Therian's case, screwed him over, but his arc actually resolves in a way that feels like there might be some potential for something further there, and unlike Alphen, it never gets no-homoed. The biggest problem with Ulbrich's story, and what keeps it from out of my top spot, in addition to number 1 just being as good as it is that his story almost feels like it could have ended at his chapter 3, which is when he confronts his former knight-at-arms who betrayed his kingdom, Erhardt, and they have a duel, and they come to an understanding, realizing that Erhardt is not happy after his betrayal, and he's sort of working very slowly to make an atonement, which is an interesting way to take a character like having a partial redemption arc. Like, he's not fully remorseful for what he's done, and he's not like totally forgiven, but he comes to Ulbrich's aid later on. But then you learn that there is this other 2D cardboard cutout villain behind him, and he's Ulbrich's final boss, and you go chase him down, and he's entertainingly hammy and all that, and he becomes a tyrant in this town, and you kind of get to be part of a resistance taking him out, which is fun and kind of dramatic, high stakes, or as high stakes as this game can be, but it feels almost anticlimactic, whereas Ulbrich's main story hook was about Erhardt, and that's where he finds, why he swings his blade, to say it in the dramatic, hammy way that he does. So good, but not great. That, of course, leaves us with Primrose as my pick for the best written character in the original Octopath Traveler. This is the character that people are comparing to Leda in Fortune's Weave because she is a dancer, and exotic dancer specifically, who is on a revenge mission. So there's the comparison there. It is surprisingly dark, and I remember back in 2018 being just like, they do not pull any punches with the fact that Primrose is a sex worker, and I appreciate that. I have seen people try to say that she's a sex slave and that nothing she does is, willing, and there's definitely some of that in her story because she's not the only sex worker in and especially her chapter 2 goes to a completely different town and shows off a brothel under arguably even worse conditions than what she comes up in. And while that is a heavy topic and something that's appropriate to tackle, I do also like when media can show sex workers who are enjoying what they do and finding some kind of fulfillment in it. And it's really debatable if Primrose counts for that or any of the characters in her story, but at least it's something, and the story is more honest about it. And her actual revenge mission lets her get dark. It lets her want to murder these men, which she does sequentially. There's 3 of them. And, there's a sense of escalation, especially with the third one, the leader, who turns out to have been a former crush of hers when she was a girl, who then literally stabs her in the back, and then goes on to stage an elaborate play based on Primrose's life, except changing it to where, they reconcile at the end, and you infiltrate that and go on stage. And I do enjoy very much the theatricality of Primrose's final chapter. It really plays with the meta aspect of dancing as performance, and what is actually real here, and what value is Primrose getting out of her revenge. And she does still carry it out, and I won't say she feels hollow in the end. I think her ending is more like hopeful about that she'll find some peace beyond her revenge quest. So between the depictions of sex work being honest, the well laid out and well structured revenge quest, the sort of campy meta quality of her final chapter and her final boss, and along with it, all of those things are why I consider Primrose to be the best written of the original Octopath Travelers. Now, I have one more question, and it's mostly going to be about Octopath Traveler, which is why I saved it for last, although here's where I finally get to talk a little bit about the second game. What is your favorite couple in gaming? Not even just official stuff. Anything you ship super hard counts. If you'd ask me about any media, I'd have to think about that for longer, because there are definitely some literary and TV and movie ships that I have connected with a lot over the years. But for gaming, there is no question. I've written fic about it. I've even done a video adaptation of one of my fics, Oswald and Portitio from Octopath Traveler 2. There's no competition. The closest would probably be Dimmy-Doo, which I've also done a video on, Dimitri and Dedue from Fire Emblem 3 Houses. But I've never written fic for them, but I have, almost 400,000 words at this point in my fic series on Octopath Traveler 2, exploring these 2 characters having a clandestine queer romance in a pseudo-19th century setting, and I have just done so many interesting things with these 2, and I think it's partially because the setting is very flexible, like an area that I've read a lot in terms of literature and things, and I get to do historical research for that, just to ground Solistia, the setting of Octopath 2, in the pseudo-19th century that it's pulling off of, which is very different from the pseudo-medieval/Renaissance thing that Octopath 1 goes for. I think because of the flexibility of how Octopath stories are made, that I can focus on these 2 characters and not so much the other 6 travelers. I have them off-screen doing their own things and going through their own stories, but until I need them for some sort of plot point, I'm content to have them be off-screen, and then sometimes I'll bring them in for a cameo, like the story I'm writing while I'm making this video. Casti the Apothecary makes an indirect off-screen cameo. That's part of it. Another part is just, again, because I'm so familiar with the type of setting here, especially New Delsta, the largest city in Octopath 2, I can really make into an analog of Paris or New Orleans, and I can bring in elements of that, including elements of my own life as a New Orleanian, in fleshing out New Delsta's queer underground. So I've come up with these things that I just genuinely have not for any other video gaming couple. Like, I have, how their relationship develops, what are character flaws that they have after their stories end. Like, I've had, Oswald learning to be more empathetic and be a more understanding partner and father to his daughter. I've had Portitio become a crossdresser and then gradually come to realizing what we would call bi-gender or gender fluid gender identity in a setting where the word gay doesn't even exist yet. So having to work all those different types of queer identity while being couched in this older pre-modern understanding of queerness, that's fascinating for me to write, and it gives me challenges when I'm trying to write things like that. I also do a lot with Partitio's two dads. If you watch that video I'm referencing, Partitio basically has two dads, and the story never really acknowledges that. It just kind of drops it in your lap and says, here, these guys have known each other for 30-ish years, and they have a lot of toxic yaoi going on, and we're just not going to talk about the fact that they function like a couple that gets divorced and then gets back together in the end of the story. So my longest fic so far has been not about Partitio and Oswald, but about those two, Pap and Rock, and their story, and I've given them a lot of backstory, a lot of stuff to deal with, internalized homophobia, just a lot of selfishness and greed that Rock canonically has. And of course, I'm also adding a lot of smut to all of this, and I don't really want to get too much into detail on that on YouTube, because YouTube could be fussy about that stuff. But I do think that sex can advance characterization or advance plot points, and so I work that into a lot of my stories. And then there's also ones where I'm just kind of riffing off the cuff, and I get inspired by an idea, and I just run with it, and I just say that this is not canon or it goes forward. Like, one time I saw art of Oswald as a centaur, and so I'm like, hey, let's make them centaurs, and let's have some kinky fun with that, and I did that. The fact that Oswald is just a genuinely hot character, just his visual design alone inspires a bunch of different kinks that you can go with, and that he's so different from what you normally see in JRPG male protagonists, because he's big and hairy and almost middle-aged, and there's just so much you can dig into with that, and I am one of the handful of people who really like this ship, because it's kind of a rare pair. Octopath on its own is a small fandom, and the biggest ship by far is not involving these two at all. It's involving Temenos the Cleric with his companion Crick, who have a very Holmes and Watson dynamic. And they're interesting. I've written them once, but Holmes and Watson stuff just doesn't really speak to me as much. And then, even then, Partitio's most popular gay ship is not with Oswald. It's with a different character who he doesn't really have as much interaction with, but my read on it is that people prefer to ship Partitio and Hikari because they're the two more conventionally attractive male travelers, excluding Temenos, who already has this thing with Crick. And it's because Oswald is this bigger, older, fatherly guy, including being a literal father. People just don't want to deal with bear daddies as much, even though I'm not biased when I say that Partitio and Oswald have more going on in canon to pull from. So yes, that is my answer. They are currently my faves, my OTP, and I'm continuing to work on them and work on stories about them or about Partitio's dads in the background while I'm, doing all of my Fire Emblem stuff that I do for my channel. I kind of alternate between the two so I don't burn out on either of them. It's useful in that way. But that was my last question. Thank you all so much who've contributed to this, or if you're still listening to this, even if you didn't and you just wanted to hear me ramble, well, now you got to do so. I very much appreciate all of you and all the support I've got for my channel. It is growing steadily, and I'm, becoming more of, I feel, an established YouTuber, even if a small one. And I do like the way I have been going forward, and I'm hoping that in 2026, when we have Fire Emblem's Fortune's Weave to talk about and look at, that my channel can grow even more as I delve into the new Fire Emblem, because that's going to be the biggest source of attention. But I mean, I do still like tackling other projects on the side when I have time for them, like, other Fire Emblem games. Like my January video is going to be about Engage. And then, of course, I like talking about things like dating sims and other RPGs that I find interesting, that I maybe want to test out the algorithm and see if it'll actually, get me views for things that I find interesting. Like that Octopath 2 video I did at the start of this year, that was mostly a labor of love, adapting a fan fiction that I wrote into a video game challenge run, but I really enjoyed making it. So varying stuff like that really helps me, as a content creator, not get burned out, and just gives me time to think of new and interesting things to give to you guys. But anyway, I am still rambling, so and I need to wrap this up. Thank you all for watching and for supporting and participating, and I will see you all in 2026. I have a lot more coming out. Au revoir.